Hello and welcome to Red Pill Rundown. I recently read Tucker Carlson's book Ship of Fools, and thought it would be good to give a quick rundown on it for those interested in learning more about his viewpoints. Would you like to know more? No worries, because here's your quick rundown on Ship of Fools. Tucker starts by stating an allegory from Plato's Republic about being on a ship run by a crew that becomes increasingly insane and incompetent, a ship of fools, and how this is becoming more real in the US with the election of Trump as a, quote, throbbing middle finger in the face of America's ruling class, end quote. The middle class in the United States has shrunk, taking home 62% of income in 1970 and only 43% in 2015, while the richest share grew from 29% to almost 50%. Manufacturing declined while finance boomed, resulting in even more consolidation of wealth and power, with the elite existing as a separate class in American society, existing very distantly from the rest of the country. Likewise, the Democratic Party used to advocate for the American worker, and now instead focuses on identity politics and an ever-increasing virtue signaling. Tucker compares the US to Venezuela, which had a large middle class that was well-educated, and as power and wealth accumulated into fewer and fewer hands, displeased voters voted for Hugo Chavez, with present-day Venezuela as a result. Ever-increasing immigration is also noted, with less than 5% of America's population being immigrants in 1970 to almost 14% in 2018, much to the benefit of both parties as Democrats get more voters and the Republican corporate donors get cheaper workers, both to the detriment of real Americans. What was the effect on the country? Thanks to mass immigration, America has experienced greater demographic change in the last few decades than any other country in history has undergone during peacetime. Our elites relentlessly celebrate those changes, but their very scale destabilizes our society. Tucker references Gallup polls that year over year consistently show that most Americans do not want higher immigration, but almost always less than the average of 1 million per year. Likewise, with foreign wars in the Middle East, which has resulted in thousands of deaths and more than $1 trillion wasted, on a region that is no more stable than it was 15 or 20 years ago. Tucker goes on to discuss the opioid epidemic, in which such related deaths have risen 400% from 1999 to 2016, with the elites essentially apathetic towards those deaths caused in part by the pharmaceutical companies that have flooded communities with said drugs. He notes that the meritocratic system fails to generate leadership qualities that generational aristocracy requires. Acing the SAT and getting a job at Goldman Sachs doesn't make you wise or empathetic to your fellow man, and such traits are a must in positions of power, as leaders need to care about those that they govern. Rulers are in charge either because they claim some higher power put them there, or because a majority of the people voted for them. Both systems have been tried for centuries. Both can work. What cannot work is where people are told they are in charge and are continually shown the opposite is the case. Oligarchies posing as democracies will always be overthrown in the end. Tucker notes how a democratic government can act as a pressure relief valve, where people don't have to burn down buildings, they can vote. Once voting is seen as a futile endeavor, anything can happen. Tucker finishes his introduction by noting that the divide between the Democrats and Republicans is just a charade at this point, and rather the real divide is between those who benefit with the elites from the status quo and the rest of us who don't. The first chapter of the book covers the convergence of the two major political parties of the US, and how they used to differ more so on economic views, how there was a balance of sorts, and how the worst decisions always come from unquestioned bipartisan consensus. Tucker grew up in a very liberal area in California in the 70s and states that, in a sense, the two parties acted as counterbalances to each other. He claims this changed during the 90s tech boom, where the left praised tech titans like Apple and Google, with the right already supporting the free market. Now both sides prefer high immigration, as previously discussed, and at the same time more automation, like self-driving trucks, which would cause more than 3 million drivers to be out of a job, and just another hit to blue-collar America. Liberals that are still anti-corporate have gone from a majority to minority, relics of a past mostly forgotten. Tucker then talks about Facebook, how it's designed to be addictive, negative side effects for the health of its users, the censorship of information at the request of multiple governments, and its massive privacy failures made more potent by the hypocritical preferences of Mark Zuckerberg to live in a private life himself. One note I found particularly interesting was a liberal non-profit Zuckerberg launched in 2013, which created a satellite organization called Americans for a Conservative Direction, a pro-immigration support group targeting the right wing, running ads for the likes of Lindsey Graham. The point was to paint Graham as a reliable conservative in order to give him sufficient cover with voters to support amnesty. He then goes on to talk about the Clintons, more so as an example of the kinds of corruption and nepotism seen within elite circles, such as Chelsea Clinton continually getting six-figure board positions of companies like IAC and Expedia, despite having no experience that would warrant such positions. Tucker focuses on immigration issues in the second chapter, carrying on the theme of the differences that used to exist in the two major political parties of the US, which are now essentially unified in their desire to import a serf class. Democrats decades ago opposed illegal immigration and even many forms of legal immigration, as the surplus of cheap labor would affect union workers. Joe Biden introduced legislation to reduce immigrants from Vietnam, accusing the Ford administration of not being honest about how many refugees would be coming over. Bill Clinton stated in his 1995 State of the Union address that all Americans are rightly disturbed by the large numbers of illegal aliens entering our country. The jobs they hold might otherwise be held by U.S. citizens or immigrants. The public services they use impose burdens on our taxpayers. The Democrat orthodoxy shifted from blue-collar workers to immigrants that would overwhelmingly vote for them, now disregarding the economic implications for American workers and focusing on social justice for immigrants, claiming in 2016 that the current quota system discriminates against immigrants of color, a laughable claim as in 2016 only 18% of immigrants were white, and thanks largely to immigration laws changing in 1965 with the focus going away from favoring European immigrants, the US went from 84% white in 1965 to 62% in 2015. The Democrats aligned themselves with Republicans who for some time had been pro-immigration. Paul Ryan produced a $1.3 trillion spending bill which included restrictions on the hiring of additional ICE agents, the capping of the number of illegal aliens ICE could detain at any given time, and $1.6 billion for border security, but that money was explicitly prohibited from being used to build a wall. In northwest Iowa is a town called Storm Lake, which is home to meatpacking plants. Thousands of workers have come into town from Asia and Latin America, resulting in a stagnation of wages, with one employee having the same hourly pay for 37 years as an unfortunate example. Years ago, the New York Times would have reported this as an attack on the American worker, a victory of management over labor. Now they simply bragged of the diversity in that Iowa is 88% white and Storm Lake is less than 50%. With a similar story mentioned in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, which was 95% white and less than 5% Hispanic in the year 2000, and 52% Hispanic just 16 years later. Pure coincidence, but Storm Lake's crime also went up and academic performance went down. Tucker notes the same story from the New York Times about Storm Lake that bragged of multiculturalism could have been a PR disaster for Tyson Foods not too long ago, and could have told readers about how the cheap immigrant labor undercutted American workers, now making less, with public services taking up the slack. The end result being taxpayers involuntarily subsidizing corporate profits. Meanwhile, the same policymakers that advocate for mass immigration live in secluded neighborhoods. As Tucker states, it's still 1985 where Bloomberg lives, and will likely always be. Barack Obama's new zip code in Washington is less than 8% Hispanic. The suburbs across the river in Virginia become more Spanish-speaking every year. Obama approves of that. He sees it as a sign of progress. He doesn't want to live near it. Diversity for thee, but not for me. Progressives like John Tanton, who helped to found local chapters of the Sierra Club and Planned Parenthood, advocated for less immigration for the sake of the environment, as higher population levels would lead to more consumption, more pollution, and more environmental degradation. However, the Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC for short, which fraudulently poses as a civil rights group used by the left to smear its opposition, devoted an entire page on its website to suggest Tanton was a Nazi. Speaking of the Sierra Club, Tucker notes that in 1989 they had a stance supporting a zero population growth position. However, after receiving hundreds of millions from billionaire David Gelbaum, the stance changed to supporting open borders, with an official from the SPLC suggesting that anyone against such a view is in league with racists, which is quite an accusation to throw at Frank Morris, a Sierra Club board member against the position change and a former executive director of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. Tucker writes that, by redefining immigration as a moral issue, elites have shut down debate over its costs. That's helpful for them, since for the affluent, immigration has few costs and many upsides. After all, the cheap labor from Latin America aren't going to compete for green energy lobbyists' jobs, but they do provide the elites with a servant class of cheap household help. Tucker finishes the chapter by noting that the elites have used up all their existing empathy on the plight of migrants, and they run out of any positive feeling for their not-as-well-off countrymen. The third chapter is called Foreign Wars, and Tucker discusses how elites have almost entirely been in favor of foreign wars seemingly without end, and despite such failings, people like Max Boot and John Bolton are still somehow seen as foreign policy experts among the elite. Napoleon Bonaparte seized control of France, crowned himself emperor, defeated 4 European coalitions against him, invaded Russia, lost, was defeated and exiled, returned, and was defeated and exiled a second time, all in less time than the United States has spent trying to turn Afghanistan into a stable country. Like the previous chapter on immigration, Tucker notes how liberals used to hold views opposite of that of conservatives, being strongly anti-war, but sadly that is no longer the case. Liberals used to make the point that war is destructive and complicated. Then with Clinton, many wars were had with Democrat approval, and many liberal politicians and those in the media were for Bush's war on terror. There was a temporary revival of the anti-war left when Bush's failings came to light in the Middle East, but the left became pro-war again once Obama was in charge. Under his charge, Gaddafi was taken out in Libya. Tucker writes that while Gaddafi was no saint, he shuttered his WMD programs in December 2003, was removed from America's list of state terror sponsors, and even collaborated with the European Union to block illegal immigration from Africa into Europe. And if there's a single lesson of the Iraq War, it's that chaos is worse than dictatorship. Libya didn't magically become some beautiful Western paradise of democracy. It became a failed state with a power vacuum. ISIS militants have found a haven in the lawless country. While Gaddafi had blocked illegal immigration to Europe, the new Libya has been powerless to stop it, and hundreds of thousands of African migrants have made their way to Europe from Libyan ports. Tucker makes a really good and concise point when he writes that, in Washington, military action is assumed to be preferable to inaction, regardless of the outcome, and that, when moral certainty meets indifference to detail, anything can happen. He also writes of neoconservatives like Bill Kristol, who founded the Weekly Standard in 1995, and was strongly against the likes of Ron Paul and Pat Buchanan because of their strong anti-war stances. Spending decades crying for war in the Middle East, including in 2006 when Kristol called for intervention in both Syria and Iran in response to Israel and Hezbollah fighting in Lebanon, Tucker uses Kristol as an example of the elites making the same mistakes about foreign policy, among other things, over and over without a shred of guilt or any real admission of wrongdoing. Shut Up, They Explained is the 4th chapter of Ship of Fools, and it focuses on the recent increase in attacks on free speech. When you're in the despised minority, being able to say what you think is the only real power you have. The opposite is also true. There's nothing more infuriating to a ruling class than contrary opinions. He writes about the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, their formation in 1920, and the many extreme court cases they took on in the name of defending free speech. However, like the previously mentioned issues of immigration and war, this did not last. Nowhere was the change more profound or perverse than at the University of California, Berkeley, birthplace of the free speech movement. From 1964 and 50 years onward, Berkeley's campus was known as a safe haven for free speech. By 2017, that was no longer the case as students violently protested speeches to be, causing at least $100,000 in property damage and innocent people injured. The justification for attacks like this, ironically, was that certain ideas are so dangerous they constitute violence and must therefore be squelched by force. Punching a speaker you disagree with isn't assault, it's self-defense. The ACLU gave up on free speech after more than 200 of its employees signed a letter condemning the 2017 Charlottesville rally. When you sincerely believe you possess the truth, all disagreement looks like apostasy. Tucker also talks of Silicon Valley, where free speech is even more under threat. He speaks of Mozilla Firefox, where in spring 2014 one of its founders became CEO, and 10 days later was forced to resign as in 2008 he had donated to Proposition 8, which banned gay marriage in California, a view at the time that was shared by Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. Regarding tech company elites, Tucker says that, "It's fair to wonder how their political views affect the products they sell. The media used to distrust government. when an investigation in 1976 led by Senator Frank Church of Idaho discovered that the CIA had engaged in multiple assassination plots against foreign leaders, reporters were outraged. Now, the media loves intelligence agencies and advocates on their behalf, including hiring them like MSNBC did with former CIA Director John Brennan. The media elites and government elites have become indistinguishable. The fifth section of the book is called The Diverstiy Diversion and speaks to how identity politics are used oftentimes by elites to distract the general populace from their abject failures. It's not a coincidence that since the life expectancy of working-class whites in America has declined, elite attacks on working-class whites have escalated. White men now kill themselves at about 10 times the rate of black and Hispanic women. Yet white men are consistently framed as the oppressors, particularly blue-collar white men. This happens to be the only group in America whose average wages have declined consistently over decades. Their privilege is nevertheless a threat to the rest of us, we're told. They've managed to destroy entire cities very few of them have ever been to, from Detroit to Newark to Baltimore. They lower test scores in schools they don't attend. They cause poor nutrition, asthma, and broken families in black neighborhoods, and in their spare time exacerbate global warming. They may be dying off before their time, but working-class white men are immensely powerful. Who came up with this storyline? It's hard to know for sure, but you'd have to guess it was someone trying to cover his tracks. Tucker also writes about how racial segregation used to be seen as evil, but now is coming back in the form of social justice, the right thing to do. Going back to Berkeley, racial protests have been common for many years, going back to protests against segregation. Now, they have protests in favor of segregation as they did in fall 2016. The protesters demanded space entirely off-limits to white people. Whites are a shrinking minority at Berkeley, just 24% of undergraduates, but according to the protesters, any was too many. Additionally, many colleges and universities now offer segregated dorms to boot. Tucker then offers many examples of professors at prestigious universities and colleges, as well as many large establishment media organizations, fueling an anti-white fire, with one example being a Texas A&M professor making a video in 2017 about when it's okay to kill white people. In 2017, supposed news organizations claimed that just about everything was racist, including credit scores, milk, the nuclear family, being on time, and white babies. Tucker then gives additional evidence of the elite's agenda. In order to justify coverage like this, you have to show that white men pose an imminent and existential threat to everyone else. Evidence for that is in short supply, so the press highlighted what they claimed was an epidemic of hate crimes. Many of those turned out to be hoaxes. At SUNY Albany in 2016, 3 female black students claimed that a white mob had assaulted them while riding a public bus. The school held a rally on their behalf. Hillary Clinton tweeted her support. A subsequent police investigation revealed the truth. The 3 girls had in fact started a fight and attacked the white students. They invented a fake hoax crime to avoid being punished. It took police weeks to discover what actually happened, in part because the white students were too afraid to contact the police themselves. Tucker gives a detailed example of a writer named Ta-Nehisi Coates who has made a living telling rich white masochists how evil they are. In his book, his 2 largest personal examples of white racism are someone he barely knew getting killed by a black cop, and a white woman being rude to his son on an escalator once. Wow. In July 2016, there was a Black Lives Matter protest in Dallas with police protecting the protesters, and a black man killed 5 officers and injured 9 more. The black police chief said, "The suspect stated he wanted to kill white people, especially white officers." At their funeral, Obama lectured the dead's family members about the racism of police in America. Tucker writes about the mainstream media trying to figure out why 2016 election exit polls showed a surprisingly high number of white Democrats voting Trump. Almost nobody suggested the obvious. If voters think you hate them for how they were born, they won't vote for you. Tucker speaks on how public schools are becoming more segregated, as in 2014, 73% of New York City's charters were less than 1% white, 90% being less than 10% white, and racial school mixtures went from 21% white in 1989 to 17% white in 2010. As mentioned in the second chapter, but now with more examples, Tucker outlines many elites and how they almost always live in very segregated neighborhoods, contrary to their speeches praising diversity. The 2016 Democratic platform became a collection of hyphenated identities for various races and sexual orientations. Another hyphenated category, white Americans, made it into the Democratic platform, but only as the subject of hostility. There are 4 references to white people in the platform. The first describes it as unacceptable that whites earn more on average than African Americans and Latinos. The next points out that it's also unacceptable that African American arrest rates are higher than those for whites. Interestingly, Asians make more than whites and also have lower incarceration rates, yet those stats go unmentioned. Tucker finishes the chapter by lamenting the loss of a united American identity. White identity politics will be a response to a world in which identity politics is the only game there is. In a country where virtually every non-white group reaps advantages from being racially conscious and politically organized, how long before someone asks the obvious question? Why can't white people organize and agitate along racial lines too? It will be a simple argument to make. Soon whites will be a minority in America. They've got enemies, as the establishment often demonstrates, as well as interests to protect. Is there some rational reason, someone will ask, why they should be the only group in America not allowed to think of themselves as a group? Elites Invade the Bedroom is the title of Chapter 6, and it entails the evolution of the feminist movement as first wanting equality and fair treatment, and moving on beyond that. Over the past 40 years, however, women have become significantly less happy with their lives across demographic groups and income levels. Other studies, like 12 years of data from the GSS, have shown that more traditional gender roles result in more satisfying marriages for women. Additionally, Tucker notes how abortion has become an inseparable part of feminism, when Susan B. Anthony called it infanticide. He writes about how promoting abortion diminishes the value not only of life, but of childbearing itself. When motherhood is less valuable to society, so are women. Yet modern feminists believe as if fertility is a threat to be feared and conquered. They devalue the one irreplaceable thing women do. They clearly believe that having children is less impressive than working at an investment bank. Tucker points out the hypocrisy of feminists ignoring or endorsing Islamic immigrants, considering their very controlling attitudes towards women, including female genital mutilation and honor killings. During New Year's Eve celebrations in Germany at the end of 2015, hundreds of women in Cologne were groped and sexually assaulted in public by mobs of men, almost entirely of Arab or North African origin. Stunningly, the police initially reacted by ignoring the attacks entirely, bothering to investigate only after widespread complaints on social media exposed the cover-up. In the British city of Rotherham, a group of Pakistani men abducted, sexually abused, and raped more than 1,400 children, primarily teenage girls, for more than a decade. Police and local government knew about the crimes, but did nothing. Officials feared that singling out the Muslim community for investigation would be decried as racist. Rotherham was merely the largest case of such abuse in the United Kingdom. It seems that abortion and Islamic tolerance are now the most important issues for feminists, rather than equal opportunities, equal rights, and equal treatment under the law. Tucker arrives at the conclusion that the transgender movement is in part a result of modern feminism. If men and women are just interchangeable cogs in a machine, then gender is just a label that can be changed on a whim. He makes a really good point when he writes that, when the people in charge retreat into fantasy and demand that everyone else join them there, society itself becomes impervious to reality. The entire population develops the habits of fact avoidance and lying. After a while, nobody can see a crisis or even admit one exists. The focus on women has also resulted in an ignoring of men's issues, such as their fallen wages, testosterone levels, and sperm counts, to their increased likeliness to commit suicide or die of a drug overdose. Women are now more educated than men, and in many high-paying industries earn more than men. The result is less marriages, as women still prefer marrying a man who earns more than them. This means more births out of wedlock, more single-parent households, more crime, and the cycle continues. They Don't Pick Up Trash Anymore is the name of the final chapter of Ship of Fools, and it discusses environmentalism and how he used to see TV commercials reminding people to pick up trash and not litter for the sake of nature, to San Francisco and Los Angeles now having piles of feces and used needles on the sidewalks as regular occurrences, and all the health hazards that come with them. Strangely, environmentalism as an idea is more popular than ever. Go to San Francisco and see for yourself. Walk through Sea Cliff or Presidio Heights or any affluent neighborhood in the city, and ask the first 5 people you meet if they consider themselves environmentalists. If only 4 say yes, chances are the 5th doesn't speak English well enough to understand the question. Tucker notes that the early environmental movement preserved wilderness, created national parks, fought pollution, and lobbied for clean air and water, all measurable goals which improved the country and restored parts of nature that were dying out. With every passing year, the goals of the environmental movement became steadily more abstract. The widespread use of DDT was causing the populations of birds of prey to fall significantly, and the populations recovered when the US government banned non-emergency use of it. However, in many areas now, wind energy companies are given legal immunity to birds killed by their turbines, causing the same bird populations to decline again, including the critically endangered California condor. Bat populations are also affected, and underwater life in the case of deep water wind turbines. Illegal immigrants have also caused environmental damage, from setting forest fires to distracted border patrol agents, to driving through and setting up drug labs in protected lands. Prominent environmental groups like the Sierra Club ask not for less, but more immigration, obviously not caring too much for the wildlife that gets harmed as a result. The Sierra Club, which was formed to maintain hiking trails in Yosemite, now takes a vigorous position in favor of transgenderism and taxpayer-funded abortion. In the summer of 2017, the Sierra Club signaled its opposition to the unsustainable whiteness of environmentalism. Tucker points out that, yet again, the elites are hypocrites, talking big talk about climate change while flying private jets around. Al Gore is the closest thing America has to a climate saint, so it may seem off that he often flies privately, and surprising that his house in Nashville uses 21 times the electricity of the average American home. Tucker finishes off the chapter by talking about how any scientists or academics that differ, even slightly, from popular opinion on environmental affairs are attacked as heathens, just like with unfashionable views on gender roles, foreign wars, and immigration. Tucker finishes the book with a telling of righting the ship. He notes that these times are not unusual within the context of history. Elites making most decisions for everyone has happened all over the world for just about all of human history. People naturally sort themselves into hierarchies, Tucker says. He writes that what makes our current situation different is the new ingredient of democracy. Massive inequality can't be sustained with this system. Revolts would be the end result. Left unintended, democracies self-destruct. Tucker states there are 2 potential solutions for the problems we face. The quickest is to suspend democracy. There are justifications for this. If your voters can't reach responsible conclusions, you can't let them vote. You don't give suffrage to irrational populations for the same reason you wouldn't give firearms to toddlers. They're not ready for the responsibility. However, he also notes there are costs to such a solution. You can't install an autocracy without widespread repression and bloodshed, especially in a secular society. The more peaceful solution, Tucker argues, is for the ruling class to attend to the population, caring about them, giving back some of the power to them, and not always overruling them. You can't enforce enlightenment by fiat. In a democracy, you can only persuade. Go slowly. It isn't easy to relinquish control to people you have power over, but try. If you want to save democracy, you've got to practice it. That's a quick rundown. Maybe not so quick. Links in the description. See you guys later.